Our next speaker is Mark Worthing. Mark Worthing holds a PhD in the history of philosophy of science from the University of Regensburg in Germany and a Doctor of Theology in Foundational and Ecumenical Theology from the University of Munich. He's currently Campus Dean of the MST Frontier Program and Pastor of St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Port Macquarie. He was formerly Senior Researcher at the Australian Lutheran Institute for Theology and Ethics and a Senior Research Fellow of the Graham Clark Institute in Adelaide. Mark has written a number of books, but perhaps most notably God, Creation and Contemporary Physics, which won the International 1997 Templeton Prize for Science and Faith Book of the Year. Mark is also a fellow of ISCAST and is a founding member of the International Society of Science and Religion. And this afternoon, he will be talking about Ian Barbour's 4 models of science and religion as applied to science fiction. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. One of my fascinations is reading and writing science fiction and fantasy, and that's got me involved in analyzing at various times and thinking about the portrayal of religion in those genres. And when it comes to science fiction, there's particularly interesting parallels that I've noticed with how religion is portrayed in its relationship to science in imagined worlds within science fiction and what exists in our real world. And I began looking at Ian Barbour's classic 4 models and wondering whether they might provide some useful insights into how we actually analyze what's going on in science fiction. So that's what I'm going to do here. And my stopwatch is running, so 20 minutes, I believe, is the agreed time.
That's correct.
Okay. So Ian Barbour first put forward this idea of his 4 basic models in his Gifford Lectures in 1989 to 1991, published subsequently as Religion in an Age of Science. And his 4 basic models are these. He said science and religion relate in one of these 4 ways. There's a conflict model, there's the independence model, the dialogue model, and the integration model. In this paper, I will propose that these well-known models, and I think anyone working in the field of science and faith should be quite familiar with them, are also applicable to understanding the various portrayals of a relationship between science and religion found in science fiction. I will further suggest that each portrayal of religion in science fiction can be understood within the broader framework of one of Barbour's 4 models. In other words, Barbour's models are as applicable and as comprehensible within the imagined worlds of science fiction as they are in our real world. Now, of course, some adaptation is needed given the unique features and terrain of science fiction. This is necessary because imagined worlds have in many places a different topography and mode of existence as compared to the real world which we inhabit. For instance, Barbour's independence model in the real world means that science and religion go about their respective business and concerns independently of one another. They have their own spheres of operation and generally do not engage with one another either negatively or positively. In science fiction, a science that does not in any way need to reference religious belief can occur in imagined worlds in which religion simply does not exist. Hence, this model often finds is not a world in which science and religion exist alongside each other, operating their respective spheres peacefully, but one in which religion simply is not a reality that merits concern or attention. Similarly, with regard to Barbour's integration model, the integration of science and religion within science fiction almost always seems to occur with some form of scientific understanding or explanation of the truth of some set of religious beliefs. And because this occurs within imagined worlds, it often takes place in very different ways than real-world integration models. Also, given the vast amount of sci-fi material available across numerous media, in the presentation time allowed, my examples for this presentation will be necessarily indicative only. So apologies if your favorite novel, comic book, or film is inexplicably and frustratingly not mentioned here. First of all, Barbour's conflict model. In science fiction, we see this manifest when religion is portrayed either on the fringe of society and existing as a problematic outlier, or as lying at the heart of evil empires or movements that rise up, determined to conquer other worlds and impose their religious views. When the conflict model appears in science fiction, it is most often manifested in religious movements, ideas, and leaders that are inevitably and necessarily in conflict with the otherwise secular and scientifically and technologically advanced culture around them. Sometimes religion is portrayed in open opposition to science and technology, but more often than not, religion is seen as using technology for its own, usually nefarious ends. The Ori religion of the Stargate television series is a classic example of this portrayal of religion. In a world with space travel and portal gates and ever more technology to make life better, the one major threat to the inhabited worlds of the galaxy is the seemingly unstoppable spread of a religion that conquers by force and imposes its rule ruthlessly. The Ori, with their robes, rituals, and fanatical beliefs, easily draw upon the imagery ranging from the history of Muslim conquest to Christian crusades. It's hard to miss the message about the inherent danger of organized religion, which in this case uses technology, but only for conquest and control, not for the betterment of humanity. Perhaps a more familiar and classic example is the original Planet of the Apes movie from 1968. An ape scientist, as you recall, fights for truth and openness against ideas that are largely religious and must be protected at all costs. In fact, the scientist who seeks to help the human protagonist in the film is even put on trial for religious heresy. Many aspects of the story are a thinly veiled commentary on the relationship of science and religion in our own world, interpreted through a conflict model lens. And I think I'll just leave with those two examples and move on. There are several others you can think of from your own science fiction awareness. Second is Barbour's independence model. And this one's a little tricky because unlike in Barbour's real world, as we mentioned, in his real world model where science and religion exist but do so in independence of each other, in science fiction, when science has its own independent existence, this model most often finds expression in the absence or deliberate deletion of religion from the imagined world and its storylines. Essentially, as scientific knowledge and technology increase, apart from any overt conflict, religion simply quietly fades away. The two areas, science and religion, are viewed as independent. So when a world is imagined in which one of these two no longer has a viable role, it simply disappears apart from any overt efforts to remove it. In science fiction, it will necessarily be religion that fades away. Otherwise, it would no longer be science fiction. And one might argue that in an imagined world in which it is science that simply fades away or never develops, we would end up with a category that we would call fantasy. But that can be debated perhaps somewhere else. Of course, in many cases, the absence of religion and religious ideas in science fiction is not the result of any specific statement about faith or religion. It simply was not a part of the storyline. So be careful not to read too much into the absence. But there are many instances in science fiction which the omission of religion is clearly deliberate and pointed. Some believe that there's simply no place in science fiction for religion. Science fiction critic Darko Suvin expresses this view when he contends that all attempts to transplant the metaphysical orientation of mythology and religion into science fiction will result only in private pseudo-myths and fragmentary fantasies or fairy tales. When a storyline makes a point of underscoring the absence of religion, of regularly referring, and you often see it with things like this, they make constant reference to things like the bad old days when religion had great power. They refer to long forgotten gods, long abandoned temples and monasteries. So the absence is not just there, but it's pointed out and underscored. When there's talk of science replacing the need for faith, then the absence of religion is clearly intentional. It is these stories which probably, I think, belong most properly to this sci-fi version of Barbour's model. The original Star Trek series is probably the most prominent example of this model. Star Trek dominated our imaginative thinking about space for almost everyone on the planet born after 1950. The original series of 79 episodes ran from September 1966 until June 1969 and set out to seek new life and new civilizations. In doing so, it created a stage upon which ethical questions, questions about the nature of future humanity, and questions about what might lie beyond were able to be explored. Its creator, Gene Roddenberry, rejected Christian faith as a teenager and seemed to have vaguely defined pantheistic personal beliefs. There were no Christian characters, indeed no openly religious characters at all among the crew of the Enterprise. 300 years into our own future, it was assumed that humanity simply moved beyond all that. On the surface, the series was a celebration of secular humanism. Yet themes relating to religion and spirituality were never far from the surface. Whether intended or not, questions about God, human sinfulness, messianic figures, and forgiveness popped up regularly. Ironically, perhaps, it seemed that even an imagined scientific and secular future semi-utopian society could not simply be done with fundamentally religious questions. Barbour's third model, the dialogue model. Religion is distinct from science, but is positively integrated into advanced future societies. Science and religion are both recognized and interact within the imagined world more or less positively. So both exist and they engage. This view occurs especially among explicitly Christian writers and also those of other religious faiths who are writing to show that religion and science, when both at their best, can work together and complement one another. It would also encapsulate the view that good science fiction simply cannot avoid religion. It might not endorse some particular religious point of view, but it cannot simply dismiss its reality. As Isaac Asimov, a secular humanist, observed, it is impossible to write science fiction that really ignores religion. Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time is an example of this model, with its overt Christian imagery and message. Though some have seen this being moderated by her own liberal brand of Christianity, which makes room for a variety of world religious perspectives. So the dark black cloud threatening various worlds is being fought by Jesus, but he's getting help from Euclid, Gandhi, and the Buddha as well. Another intriguing example is Walter Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz. This novel begins with a dystopian world, but moves back toward a world impacted positively by science and light with the help of religion, specifically, and somewhat ironically for many, the Roman Catholic Church. Its positive portrayal of organized religion and Catholicism and the role it plays in helping the world recover from a nuclear apocalypse stands in stark contrast to the usual portrayal of the church in science fiction. Also, perhaps in this category, and one of the examples that's not specifically devoted to a particular religious belief, would be Frank Herbert's Dune and that series, first published in 1965. It's a story in which science and religion are, in most instances, thoroughly integrated. Religious beliefs and religions can be both good and bad in the story, but they are not belittled or seen as unimportant or simply false. The religion of the Bene Gesserit is key to the storyline. Instead of religion's ultimate demise, Herbert portrays a future unification of religions with his famous Orange Catholic Bible, as well as unlikely construct religions such as Buddhism, Mahayana Christianity, and my personal favorite, Zen Sunni Catholicism. And just to show that the development of these great religious amalgamations was realistic, in line with real-world histories of religious conflict, the production of the Orange Catholic Bible, which is explained in some detail in appendix, on the religion of Dune tells us that many members of the committee lost either their careers or their lives because of their involvement, and the riots provoked by the Bible's release cost 80 million lives. So there's a bit of crossover in Dune with conflict models, but the significant difference is that religions were not fighting against science, but against each other. Finally, and we'll spend a bit more time on this one if we can, Barbour's integration model. As manifest in science fiction, religion and science turn out in these models to be pretty much the same thing. So the integration is quite radical in science fiction, not just a meshing together or some merging, but it's quite complete in most cases. Religious views in these stories are discovered to have been basically correct, if limited in their understanding, and science is only catching up. But whereas in the real world of science and religion, integration is manifest in unified or even unitary worldviews in which science and religion inform one another, in science fiction, it's more often manifest in the revelation that religion and science often turn out to be the same thing. This most often occurs in stories in which religion is portrayed as having been constructed by individuals or groups who were not fully cognizant of the scientific and technological explanations behind their belief systems. A current and popular example of this model can be found in the Marvel Universe series, and many of you have probably seen the movies or went with your children or grandchildren, and it's quite interesting. For instance, here, Thor and the other Norse gods turn out to be real. We just didn't understand their technology or that they came from other worlds. In these stories, science does not replace religion, it explains it or makes sense of it. For some, this might simply be another, though perhaps unexpected, form of science conquering religion. But importantly, in these stories, religion is not replaced or denied, and its adherents are not denigrated. And while we're thinking of comic book science fiction, we cannot overlook the long-running Superman comics and movies. Here we have a powerful savior figure who, especially in the film series, takes on increasingly obvious parallels to Jesus. But his divine-like powers are not explained as supernatural. There is a scientific explanation. He's from another planet and of a different species. On Krypton, Kal-El would be normal. On Earth, he comes across as a god. But the point is, he's not a god, and he does not require or accept worship because there is a scientific and rational explanation for his existence and his powers. Another branch of the model of religion and science turning out to be the same thing can be seen in those stories which portray a future, scientifically advanced world which affirms the ultimate reality and truth of religion, often the religion that the writer embraces. An early and classic example of this is the sci-fi trilogy of C.S. Lewis. In the first book of his series, Out of the Silent Planet from 1938, it's revealed that what the pagan religion saw as gods and even planets, and what Christians identify as angels, are actually beings of light called Eldila in interplanetary space. Another take on this model is found.
Sorry, excuse me.
I'm getting music here.
Needs to be on mute. Jackie might find that person.
Yeah.
And will they be punished when they're found?
You can continue now, Mark.
Okay. Okay, let's just skip it. We're running short on time. You're familiar with this. There's a lot of books that you wouldn't be very familiar with because a lot of these show up in Christian bookshops and try to do these integrated models, and they're quite interesting. But let's go to something a bit more familiar. The Star Wars franchise of movies also fits into this model, religion and science blending into one. The Force is perhaps the best known of science fiction religions. It even has a following in the real world in which thousands list Jedi as the religion in every census, whether in the US or Australia. The Force itself is explained in the films by the existence of midichlorians, which occur in concentrations in some beings and seem to be passed on hereditarily, as with the Skywalker family. These minute particles can be observed through testing and seem to work together to achieve a balance in the Force. Author George Lucas explained this in a 2013 interview. Midichlorians are a race that everybody knows about in the world of Star Wars. The way you interact and interface with this larger energy field, the Force, is through the midichlorians, which are sensitive to energy. They are the core of your life, which is the cell, the living cell. They are in a symbiotic relationship with the cell, and then because they're all interconnected as one, they can communicate with the larger force field. That's how you deal with the Force. So the religion of Star Wars, is revealed finally in the fourth film, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, is not a supernatural force, as many had supposed, but is explained by scientifically verifiable forces within the natural world, but yet people continue to take it as a religious movement. The movie Avatar also falls into this category, where the apparently simple peoples of the planet Pandora have strong religious beliefs. In contrast, the newcomers from Earth who are exploring the planet show no signs of religious belief and practice, often disparaging that of the local inhabitants. And in the end, they seek to destroy the main symbol of their religion. But the local Pandoran religion is shown not to be mere wishful thinking, but a reality. It's not a supernatural reality, but rather a naturally occurring reality on that planet that the newcomers from Earth have failed to understand. A more extreme example of integration might be found in the Matrix trilogy. This is, of course, a very dystopian world in which there's a rather extreme blend of science and religion. And for those interested in that, I actually wrote a book on the Matrix trilogy from 2004 called The Matrix Revealed, and you can examine that more closely. But basically, what all these varied examples share in common is an understanding of science and religion, in which religious faith is not falsified, denigrated, or doomed to fade away, but it is, however, understood through the lens of science. The superstition is taken out of religion, but the religion is not simply discarded. It is, for the world of science fiction, perhaps the ultimate integration of science and religion. So that's an interesting manifestation of this model in the altered rules of imagined worlds in science fiction. In conclusion, Barbour's four models, with some adaptation for imagined worlds, I believe are a useful tool for understanding the variety of portrayals of religion within science fiction. Such portrayals are important because they have real-world implications for how the relationship between science and religion is understood, and therefore merit serious attention from those engaged in the science and faith dialogue. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. I'm just going to go quickly into questions. Neil Bergman asks, are these models more present in dystopian or utopian imagined futures?
I originally thought that they were more prominent in utopian futures because utopian futures have very optimistic views of where science and technology lead us. So I originally started doing a larger study of this, which this paper is just a small part of, and limited myself to utopian models. But I kept finding great examples in dystopian worlds as well, like the Matrix trilogy and the integration model. It's just that the view of science in dystopian worldviews and technology are less optimistic than we might find in our own world. But whether they occur in utopian or dystopian worlds, I find everything tends to fit into one of the four categories when you've made adaptations for the changed nature of imagined worlds. But they're probably easier to spot in utopian worlds.
Okay, now we've got a series of questions from Anonymous. I'm not sure if that's just one person or several people. Do you have any comments regarding any of C.S. Lewis's dystopian novels?
Yes, I did mention it there. It follows into a more integration view. His view is that in a future world where science and technology are greatly advanced, through science technology, we begin to discover the reality and truth of things like sin and redemption and angelic beings. So it would be an early example of an integrated model in which a Christian writer is showing that ultimately science and faith do fit together.
Okay. And how might these categories, do you think, be helpful in teaching science fiction literature?
Well, I think they'd be quite useful because an important part of the human reality existence is the religious and spiritual aspect. So it's hard for science fiction to avoid it. Even something like the early Star Trek series that tried to look like religion had passed away just couldn't quite escape that. So I think this gives us the way to analyze what's going on and realize and wonder how, in one case, religion might seem to be ignored, in another it's evil, in another it's integrated and positive, in another they seem to coexist rather in be in dialogue with each other. How does this all fit together and happen? I think it's quite useful. Perhaps more useful is for those of us trying to understand the influence of how people perceive science and faith. The Star Trek series, for instance, influenced a whole generation of people that decided they wanted to be scientists, study space science, do those kind of things. It prompted the imagination, but along with it came a lot of the baggage of the religious and the ethical perspectives. So the films and the stories, the comic books, the manga, the Marvel Universe series that's having a big influence now is very likely to be playing a very noticeable yet subtle role in the way that future generations of thinkers are viewing the science-faith relationship. So I think it's important for us to see what this impact is and how and what this messaging is, and not just ignore it because it's not in the real world.
Mm. Okay. Neil, you had another comment. Did you want to? Is that?
Oh, I just said in the Star Trek series, one example, you could see an example of personal independence in the same way that scientists today, might be Christians on a Sunday at church and then be, very rationalist in their scientific work. In the original Star Trek series, you see Spock portrayed as logical when he's a science officer, and then he almost goes crazy, if you like, and goes illogical when he has to go through the Vulcan mating rituals.
But that's not a religious. That's a biological thing that they go through. But yeah, they did struggle with the fact that logic wasn't everything. But there's a discomfort with religion in the series that's quite marked. It's interesting how sci-fi deals with religion or doesn't. But it says a lot about how society's thinking as well as influencing the way we think. So I think it is important to try to analyze, and I think it is useful. And anyone that's teaching science fiction, if you look at these models, it's one other strand you can add to the teaching of science fiction as literature to say this is interesting, because even when you take these imagined worlds, there are only so many ways that science and religion can relate to each other. And it's essentially not different in imagined worlds than it is in the real world. It just comes across with some different nuances in places.
Jackie, can I just check how we're going for time? Have we got time for more questions or?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that just disappeared, that question. Oh, somebody had written, that you, like, as an example, Thor is an example of, say, integration, but is that more an example of where science and religion may be in conflict? Is that sort of...
I think in the imagined world, it'd be interesting if the point of it was, once we discovered what Thor was, everyone ridicules the followers and the people that had the religious belief, but instead it seems to be more to uplift and say, hey, they weren't so crazy. There was something there. There really were these godlike creatures coming. They just didn't understand them because their technology was beyond our own. Superman does the same thing, essentially. So science doesn't end up dispensing with religion. It just simply justifies and explains it. And people still continue to have faith and have their rituals, but now all of a sudden it makes sense. For those that follow Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, a good example of this is the Bajorans. Because later in Star Trek, they try to get a bit of positive spin on religion. So they have the Bajoran religion and the prophets that speak to them from the wormhole. And it's all a bit problematic. And the people from the Deep Space Nine are trying to understand how this works. But then it turns out that there are alien beings living in the wormhole that kind of cross, time, and they really are giving them messages and telling them things. So the religion ends up having a scientific explanation. But when the Bajorans realize this, they continue to follow their rituals and their worship and their other bit, even though they understand that it all has an explanation that's not supernatural.
Okay. Finally, as a science fiction lover, what is your favourite science fiction novel?
There's a number I like. Some of the ones I like best are very rare and not seen. Cantico for Leibowitz is very, very good. And for classics, I have to admit, I do like Dune, even though it's perplexing and baffling in places, but I kind of like some of the old school things. So, and yeah, some of the quirkier ones and writers. And a lot of the Philip K. Dick stuff is just, even though it's decades old, is still just classic, and he deals with religious perspectives as well. So there's some classic greats out there.
Great, thank you, Mark. Can you join with me in thanking Mark for his great talk? Thank you.